The subject of consumer vulnerability remains high on the FCA agenda. But who is vulnerable? What should firms be doing? And where can you get help? Earlier, I spoke to James Dingwall of Thistle Initiatives and Anthony Gore from Just. Here's how the conversation went.
James, what steps should firms consider to identify vulnerable customers?
I think the first thing is there's a common misconception that a vulnerable customer is actually an individual who has a disability that's visual. It is just not the case. There could be many various different reasons why customers could be vulnerable, such as a mental disability, it could be age, they could be too young, they could be too old, it could be all stages of their lives. So firms really need to understand the types of customers that they deal with and then identify from that batch what types of vulnerabilities will firms actually be dealing with. And then the most important element of this is to educate their staff to how to identify and deal with vulnerable customers.
I think when you go back to the original occasional paper 8 in 2015, the FCA gave a definition really, which is about those individuals who were particularly susceptible to detriment if a firm wasn't acting with due levels of care. But actually they just produced a new document which came out very, very recently, and they kind of redefine and build on that to say it's those people they say who are readily identified as less able to engage and or may suffer disproportionately if things go wrong. So it really is wide-reaching. It's actually quite difficult to really put into words precisely who a vulnerable customer actually is.
Absolutely, and I think we've seen some very, very good behaviours from firms around actually educating both their customer base to ask for help if they're unsure at any stage of the sales process or when they're speaking to a contact centre, to also providing material throughout their branches, for example, or online. It's been really good to see some firms actually really making a big step towards listening to the FCA and what they're expecting to achieve, but also more importantly, helping the customer out.
With pension planning, are people aware of the risks of drawdown?
I think the issue that I see more than most is you end up with an individual approaching retirement who maybe has a more secure pension pot, and then the options that are available, and you've kind of got this little pot of gold that people are looking at and thinking, I could actually do an awful lot with that money that I wouldn't be able to do with a more secure, sustainable income. And I think my concern is now is while we've got stock markets as high as what they are, without some really good financial planning from a really good, competent financial advisor, customers can actually end up in a lot of bother, because if they're drawing down high levels of income where the markets are really high, it's generally quite sustainable. Do we think the markets are going to stay where they're at for the next 24, 36 months? I guess that's another debate, but I think some really strong financial planning so the customer understands the risks of drawdown is probably sometimes a bit lacking.
I think there's another aspect there as well, which is when you look at vulnerability and what it actually means. Of course, vulnerability can be temporary, permanent, sporadic. And when you're looking at those sorts of terms that we're viewing in terms of the retirement journey, vulnerability could happen at any point. You only have to look at the issues in terms of substituted decision makers, what happens if the client loses capacity during that journey, when should you involve a power of attorney, these types of things. I mean, just looking at some of the trigger points that the FCA list here in terms of what might cause vulnerability, you've got health issues that might change through that journey, whether that's cognitive, whether it's physical, these types of issues.
I think as well is that advice just isn't around that one point in time. Advice from a good financial planner is around that initial piece of advice, but also the ongoing obligation to service that client, because if they do go into drawdown, for example, it's not just a one piece of advice, it's the rest of their lives that they need that help and support for not 5 years, 10 years. Health situations can change in a matter of days and weeks. It all needs to be considered.
And one of the things that the FCA are now talking about is resilience in terms of vulnerability. And when we look at things like the pension journey, we've always talked about capacity for loss. How would people cope if all of a sudden their bills couldn't be paid and so on? And one of the areas of vulnerability that the FCA are focusing on now is, those people who might particularly be susceptible if things go wrong to have bad outcomes, and what's their resilience financially if things go wrong. So again, over that long period of time, I think that's another consideration.
Some great points there.
So are people spending their pension pots early creating a potential vulnerability issue for the future?
I mean, look at the number of people that you look at pension cash-ins and the pension freedoms, and the biggest cohort so far has been aged 55 to 59. So the question is, are they really retiring, and have they understood the implications when they do actually come to, take actual real retirement, and how that might play out, given the fact that they may have already extinguished part of their fund.
Yeah.
James, what could firms be doing better?
I think understanding that a vulnerable customer isn't just someone with a disability that you can actually see. I think firms need to be educated more on the fact that it could be so many different scenarios, but it's the education of their staff to actually spot and identify, to give that customer the support they need, no matter what stage of their life they're in. I think, to me, that's a bit that's lacking. It's the training and competence of the staff to ensure that their staff know and are able to identify who a vulnerable customer is. I think one of the things that we do see is that some firms have really made a great effort to support customers, and that could be anything from making literature available on their website to actually, when they're having one-to-one discussions, right at the outset and at the end, firms are actually saying, if you didn't understand what I've asked you, if you need additional support, or you need help with this in writing, anything further, we're here to support you. So there's been some great work by firms, but we've also seen some firms that have spent time developing a 30, 40, 50-page policy where it confuses people. And actually, all they actually want to see is just, what do I need to do and how does it apply to me? So I think developing a policy and a framework around vulnerable customers is a good thing, but don't overcomplicate it, and make sure your staff are educated.
I mean, again, going back to the original occasional paper number 8, you've got the practitioner's guide in there where the FCA gives some guidance in terms of how to recognise vulnerability, what questions you should be asking, some protocols and some processes. I mean, from our own perspective, we've got our technical bulletin that is available to advisors as well, and here we list probably half a dozen or so things that advisors might need to think of. So just considering a written approach to vulnerability. Many would say this is really just an extension of TCF, treating customers fairly, but actually, is it written down? What evidence do you have of that? And secondly, how does that impact on existing policies and procedures? When you look at the FCA business plan 1718, they talk about even themselves making sure they've taken account of people who might be vulnerable. So when they're designing their own policies, so technological change, societal change, policies that take advantage of those issues, how does that impact vulnerable clients? And so for a firm, are they taking into account existing policies and procedures and how this impacts? Getting feedback from clients in various ways. What are we good at as a firm? How could we have helped the client more? And that might even be addressing third parties as well, to see how an advice firm might have coped better or offered a better service. Breaking down appointments into 2 or 3 appointments, because of somebody's, perhaps difficulties in understanding, as James has said, things like this. The role of third parties, when's it appropriate to bringing somebody to deputise and make decisions for that individual, and what are the data protection issues around some of that as well. And again, there's guidance on that advisors can get hold of. And then training, whether it's for the advisor themselves or other people within their firm. How do they react and respond to people who might be in contact with them that might be, actually living with something that makes it difficult for them to engage? These types of things as well.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that firms really need to understand as well is that a written policy actually only works for probably a limited amount of customers now. Customers are more and more becoming visual. So it's really understanding, as you've said there, your customer base, to actually understand what is the best way to communicate with our customer base. Because you'll probably find that as you set out the age brackets, there's a different way to actually approach each age graphic. Some of them might actually want more video, some of them might actually want written. It's having the availability to understand your customer base, to actually target them appropriately.
Yeah. I think the other aspect is to know where as a firm you're dealing with a vulnerable client, and actually your expertise has come to a point where you need to refer on to somebody else. And we see that in things like the care market, equity release, but I think it's wider than that. You're talking about things like, well, are there any other external organisations for debt advice or counselling, and having an even wider remit than that. But certainly those are areas that advisors might want to build into their policy.
Educating the staff, whether or not it be someone who's first line on the call with a customer, or whether it's the advisor giving the advice, or whether it's the chief exec that might be dealing with an issue or a complaint from a customer. It's being able to understand and identify where they can help.
So James, do firms have a duty of care to evidence that they are dealing with vulnerability effectively?
Absolutely. I think we all have an individual responsibility as well. But I think it goes back to the firm's conduct risk framework. This is a subsection of conduct risk here. It's around firms ensuring that they're doing as much as possible to ensure the customers are getting a good outcome. So being able to evidence that you have appropriate policies, procedures, and more importantly, you're achieving good outcomes for those vulnerable customers is absolutely important.
Such a quite interesting point, because if you look at the FCA's document that I mentioned earlier, the Financial Services Consumer Panel and certain other stakeholders are now really pressing to get the FCA to look at this in more depth. In fact, what they've said is that we've committed to produce a discussion paper on the introduction of a duty of care as part of a handbook review. However, it does go on to say, following the UK exit from the European Union. So when that's going to be, we'll have to wait and see, but certainly it's going to remain on the agenda for some time.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you found that discussion on consumer vulnerability helpful. And if you need any further information, such as our technical bulletin on consumer vulnerability, then please get in touch with your usual point of contact here at Just, or look us up at justadvisor.com.